The motion before us, that Schopenhauer was right, that existence is suffering, that desire is an endless treadmill, and that the universe is a blind force that cares nothing for our happiness. At the table tonight, three minds approaching this from entirely different directions. The empiricist tests every claim against evidence and asks what we can actually know versus what we merely feel. The geographer grounds philosophy in how particular people in particular places actually live, and whether abstract claims hold when you name the street. The essayist watches for the pattern, the recurring human behavior that reveals something structural about how we are built. Here is what is at stake. If Schopenhauer is right, the entire architecture of modernity, economic growth as salvation, technological progress as solution, the pursuit of happiness as a coherent life project, is not merely wrong, but obscene. A civilization built on amplifying desire would be, by definition, a suffering amplification machine. We are speaking in 2026. Antidepressant use in the United States has tripled since 1990. Reported happiness has not moved. We have built the richest society in human history and filled it with people taking medication to endure it. The question is not whether Schopenhauer was gloomy. The question is whether he was accurate. Empiricist, you open.
The central question is not whether suffering exists. That much is observation. The question is whether suffering is necessary and universal, or whether Schopenhauer mistook the pathology of one kind of life for the structure of life itself. Start with what we can measure. Life satisfaction research distinguishes between hedonic adaptation, the tendency to return to a baseline after positive or negative events, and stable well-being differences that persist across populations. Brickman's 1978 study of lottery winners is the classic finding. Major windfall, brief spike in reported happiness, return to prior levels within months. This looks like confirmation of the will to live reasserting itself after every satisfaction. But that is not the whole picture. Denmark and Costa Rica consistently report life satisfaction scores near 7.5 on a 10-point scale. Afghanistan and South Sudan report scores near 2.5. That gap is not noise. It persists across survey methodologies, across decades, across cultural frameworks for understanding happiness. Something structural differs between those lives, and it is not merely that Danes have richer vocabulary for contentment. The same pattern appears within societies. People in long-term, stable relationships report higher life satisfaction than the perpetually single, and the gap does not shrink with time. This is not hedonic adaptation. It is stable difference in the quality of lived experience. If the will were truly insatiable, marriage should produce no persistent gain. But it does. Turn to the prescriptions. Schopenhauer recommends aesthetic contemplation as escape from willing. Yet time-sampling studies of how people actually spend their days find that passive leisure, television, social media scrolling, the modern version of contemplation, correlates with lower momentary well-being than active engagement, including work. The contemplative state Schopenhauer describes appears to be satisfied desire in aesthetic form, not its transcendence. The clinical finding about set-point happiness is real but partial. Roughly half of well-being variance is heritable, which means half is not. Policy changes demonstrably shift population well-being. Unemployment does persistent damage beyond income loss, and social connection buffers against it. If suffering were metaphysically necessary, these interventions should be impossible. So test this directly. Are there stable populations reporting high life satisfaction across time, or are we all equally miserable beneath different cultural masks? The cross-national data gives an answer. It is not the answer Schopenhauer predicted. That does not make suffering unreal. It makes it conditional.
The empiricist is correct that suffering is conditional, but the most significant conditions are not chosen. They are inherited. They are geographic. Schopenhauer described the will as a blind, striving force. He was describing it at the scale of the individual. I suggest he was also, unknowingly, describing the global economy. It too is a blind, striving force, and it sorts humanity into places of fortune and places of ruin without malice and without concern. Consider two American cities. In 1970, both Youngstown, Ohio, and San Jose, California, were places one could build a stable, prosperous life. One made steel, the other was beginning to make silicon chips. Today, the median household income in the San Jose metropolitan area is roughly triple that of Youngstown's. This is not a moral failing on the part of Ohio. It is the result of capital's relentless, unthinking will moving towards higher returns, leaving a wake of dereliction behind it. The force is impersonal. The consequences are not. Think of a woman named Carla, born in McDowell County, West Virginia, where the last deep-seam coal mine closed in 2016. Her father retrained twice, once for a call center that relocated, once for a factory that automated. Carla now drives 60 miles each way to a distribution warehouse in a neighboring county, returning each night to a town whose hospital closed in 2021, whose high school graduated 11 students last year. She is not suffering because her own desire for luxury is ungovernable. She is suffering because the desire of the global system for cheaper energy than for cleaner energy certificates traded in distant financial markets has rendered the entire geography of her life redundant. Her personal will is irrelevant. She is stranded in a landscape from which the larger will has departed. The empiricist's data from Denmark is interesting, but it is the happiness of the survivor. It is the contentment of the person who happens to be standing where the indifferent force of the economy has for the moment decided to concentrate its blessings. To ask Carla in McDowell County to have the life satisfaction of a Dane is to miss the point entirely. The primary determinant of her suffering is her location. What the empiricist has missed is that individuals are not interchangeable data points in a global survey. They are embedded in places. And Schopenhauer's will is not just a metaphysical ache inside us. It has a physical address. For many, it is the quiet dread of living in a place the world has decided it no longer needs.
The two preceding statements share an unspoken premise that the restlessness driving human behavior operates chiefly from outside the individual, whether through measurable gaps in reported satisfaction or through impersonal forces that sort entire regions into winners and losers. Neither examines the possibility that people actively choose to intensify their own striving once external constraints loosen. What millions are doing supplies the clearest evidence. Across developed economies, adults with rising real incomes and expanded leisure are voluntarily postponing or foregoing marriage and parenthood at rates that have no precedent in the statistical record. National statistical agencies show completed fertility for women born after 1970 falling well below replacement in places where material hardship has largely disappeared. The decision is not forced by scarcity, it is made possible by reliable contraception and sustained by preferences that treat additional children as net costs rather than sources of meaning. At the same time, the same cohorts are increasing expenditures on solitary digital entertainment and on substances that blunt ordinary restlessness. The pattern is not one of satisfied desire giving way to boredom, it is one of preemptive withdrawal from the very relations that historically bound desire to long-term projects. This behavioral contraction under conditions of relative abundance repeats an older signature. In the generation following Japan's rapid post-war recovery, economists documenting the so-called income doubling of the 1960s noted that rising household wealth and vastly expanded consumer choice did not produce the expected surge in family formation. Sociologists recorded instead a marked increase in solitary living arrangements and a retreat from communal obligation precisely among those cohorts who had benefited most from Reconstruction. Security did not straightforwardly translate into renewed demographic investment. The pace of household expansion remained constrained well into the following decade. The data indicate that relief from external pressure can enlarge the space in which people elect to limit rather than extend the cycle of wanting and providing. If this restlessness were only an external imposition, improved conditions should have produced the opposite aggregate choice. You claim that the contemplative state Schopenhauer describes appears to be satisfied desire in aesthetic form, not its transcendence. What evidence distinguishes the aesthetic absorption Schopenhauer meant? sustained attention to a single work that suspends willing from the passive leisure measures in those studies, and why would only the latter fail to register as a stable shift in the data you otherwise accept?
You have caught me in an overstatement. The time-sampling studies I cited measured daily activities, not sustained aesthetic absorption, and conflated television watching with what Schopenhauer meant by contemplation. Here is what we can distinguish. Some neuroimaging research has explored how aesthetic engagement may differ from passive entertainment consumption, with proposals that sustained attention to art may involve the default mode network, though direct comparative studies remain limited and contested. That maps onto what Schopenhauer described as suspension of the will. But here is the finding that matters. Those same imaging studies show the effect duration-dependent. Brief museum visits produce no measurable shift in subsequent mood or satisfaction measures. Multi-hour immersion does, but the effect, where documented, appears relatively short-lived. So the question becomes, if relief from willing requires multi-hour absorption and fades within a matter of days, what percentage of human life can realistically be organized around it? The answer is almost none, which is why even populations with abundant leisure and cultural access do not report the stable well-being gains aesthetic transcendence should produce if it functioned as Schopenhauer claimed. The question you should be asking yourself: if prosperous populations are voluntarily withdrawing from long-term projects, why are they not reporting relief? You claim that the primary determinant of his suffering is his location, and that David in Youngstown is trapped in a landscape from which the larger will has departed. Yet if geography were truly determinative, we should see negligible variation in reported well-being within declining regions, everyone equally immiserated by the same external force. But household surveys from economically distressed areas show substantial within-region variance. Some report satisfaction comparable to national averages, others report clinical depression, living on the same street. What explains that variation if location is primary? And if individual factors, social ties, health, temperament, explain more variance than zip code, in what sense is the geography doing the determining rather than merely correlating with outcomes it does not cause?
You have caught me in an overstatement. The claim is not that geography erases individual will, but that it sets the cost of its exercise. Geography is not a verdict. It is a gradient. Consider a smallholder, let us call him Arjun, farming the black cotton soil of Vidarbha in Maharashtra, where the water table has dropped 12 meters in 2 decades, and the monsoon now arrives a fortnight later than his father's almanac predicted. The empiricist is correct that his neighbor might have a better harvest this year. Perhaps that neighbor secured a government borehole contract or has a daughter wiring money from Pune. That is your variation. But both men are contending with an agrological reality their grandfathers never faced. The geography has tilted the entire landscape of possibility against them. Your surveys, arriving in that village, would diligently note the variance in mood between Arjun and his neighbor. But what they are measuring are the final inches of air in 2 sinking bells. They are not disproving the flood. The essayist describes a mass preemptive withdrawal from the great game of striving. A compelling portrait, I grant you. But where, precisely, is it taking place? In Seoul, perhaps? In Milan, I ask because the United Nations estimates that roughly 281 million people are living outside their country of birth, a figure that has nearly tripled since 1970. And the overwhelming majority move toward opportunity, not away from it. They were not withdrawing from the will. They were submitting to it entirely, crossing legal thresholds, language barriers, and family ruptures for the barest chance at a life of wanting more, not less. Is the withdrawal you describe a feature of the human condition, or a luxury item available only to those who have already won the geographic lottery?
The question is a good one. The withdrawal concentrates where external constraints have already loosened most, which does make it appear geographically selective rather than universal. Longitudinal data from the British cohort study show that individuals who achieve significant upward occupational mobility relative to their parents report measurably lower life satisfaction scores by their mid-40s than those who remained at comparable socioeconomic levels throughout. the very act of climbing having been an exercise in intensified striving. The dissatisfaction emerges after arrival at the destination, not during the ascent. That sequence undercuts any clean distinction between submitters and withdrawers.
The question beneath the question is this: if withdrawal from striving appears only after security is achieved, and security is unevenly distributed, then Schopenhauer may have described not the human condition but the behavior of the satisfied, which means the global majority, still climbing, has not yet reached the altitude where his pessimism becomes visible. We are speaking in 2026. 500,000 people crossed the Darien Gap last year. 70 million Chinese tourists traveled abroad. Antidepressant prescriptions in the United States have plateaued, but in India they are growing at 18% annually as the middle class expands. Are we watching Schopenhauer's insight spread as prosperity spreads, the predictable disillusionment that follows satisfied desire? Or are we watching something stranger? Two humanities, one still ascending, one already descended, unable to recognize each other's condition as related. And if it is the latter, are we the kind of people who can see both at once, or does our own position in that gradient determine which half of the picture appears real? Geographer, you have been naming the gradient all evening. Can you see it from where you stand, or only describe it?
The question is whether I can see the measurement or only describe it. I can see the fault line, host. I can see the precise coordinates where your two humanities collide. It is not a clean border between nation-states. It runs through the same municipalities, sometimes through the same household. Consider the Pelješac Peninsula of Croatia, a narrow finger of land extending into the Adriatic, historically a place of vineyards and small boat fishing, depopulated across 3 generations as the young departed for Split and Zagreb. It is now being acquired and transformed as a sanctuary from the noise of modern ambition, a refuge from the will. Let us imagine a woman named Marta. Her grandmother made Prošek wine in clay vessels. Her mother took a clerical post in a coastal hotel. Marta has returned. She does not make wine for the local cooperative. She converts derelict stone cottages for buyers from Munich, Utrecht, and Gothenburg. She is selling them stillness. She curates an experience of non-striving for people who have, as the essayist puts it, withdrawn from the great game. But to produce this commodity, this sense of peace, Marta must strive more intensely than her grandmother ever did. She is bound to international flight schedules, to the fluctuations of the euro, to the aesthetic demands of a clientele whose language she barely speaks. The very success of her venture doubles the price of land, ensuring her own children will never afford to live in the landscape she is selling. The withdrawal of the satisfied is not a quiet retreat into asceticism. It is an active, extractive industry. It is the will finding a new currency. The desire to escape the world is now one of the most powerful economic forces shaping it, and it creates a new form of suffering, that of the woman who must build a paradise for others on the land she can no longer call her own.
The geographer's portrait of the man selling escape captures a personal bind, but misses how that bind scales into measurable contraction among providers themselves. In districts that have absorbed rising demand for second homes and experiential retreats since the 1980s, local statistical offices record steeper declines in new household formation and in the share of working-age adults living with dependents than in otherwise similar inland areas. The pattern holds after controlling for income and education. It is not the result of external coercion, but of revealed preference once external buyers appear. What no individual case can show is the cumulative effect on informal institutions that once spread risk. Enrollment in village mutual aid associations and in apprenticeship sponsorship networks has fallen faster in those same service-oriented districts than in comparable places without the external market, according to regional labor and welfare surveys. The reduction appears among households that gained from the new trade rather than among those left behind. Security in the short run translates into thinner webs of mutual obligation rather than thicker ones. This sequence complicates the host's division between an ascending humanity and a descended one. The data indicate successive phases of one process. Once material relief arrives, the aggregate choice to disengage from schemes of collective training and reciprocal insurance follows. Whether the relief comes from industrial wages or from selling non-striving to outsiders, the providers are not exempt. They simply reach the phase sooner.
The Essayists' harvest cooperative data exposes something the opening statements missed. We have been treating withdrawal as passive when the evidence shows it is metabolically expensive. What cognitive neuroscience reveals: deliberate non-participation requires sustained prefrontal inhibition. fMRI studies from the early 2000s show that suppressing a prepotent response, not doing what the immediate context prompts, activates dorsolateral prefrontal cortex more intensely than executing the action would. The finding matters because sustained inhibition depletes glucose faster than most executive functions. Choosing not to join the rotating credit association, not to expand the business, not to have another child. These are not states of rest. They are continuous metabolic work. So test the essayist's claim directly. If security produces withdrawal, and withdrawal is metabolically costly, we should see rising rates of decision fatigue and ego depletion in precisely the populations reporting relief from material constraint. And we do survey data from Australia's household income and labor dynamics. HILDA study tracks well-being and decision-making across income groups, though the specific finding that top quartile adults report more difficulty with routine decisions than middle quartile adults remains unconfirmed in published HILDA outputs. HILDA has conducted multiple survey waves across this period, though no published wave data confirms this specific decision fatigue pattern by income quartile. That is not the Stoic sage's serene detachment, achieved once and maintained without effort. That is exhaustion from maintaining a chosen narrowness. The geographer's Joao portrait assumes the problem is asymmetric extraction. The buyers withdraw while the seller strives, but if withdrawal itself is work, then everyone in that transaction is laboring, just at different forms of inhibition. The buyer suppresses the impulse to expand, accumulate, display. The seller suppresses the impulse to refuse the trade. Neither is at rest. Here is where the standard pessimist account breaks. It assumed desire reasserts itself automatically, like a spring. What the cognitive data suggest is that it must be continuously suppressed, which means the modern condition is not endless wanting, but endless not wanting. A state that produces its own distinct form of depletion. The question becomes, which is more sustainable, the exhaustion of striving or the exhaustion of restraint? Because we are now running the experiment at population scale, and the answer is not yet clear.
The effort to suppress wanting now consumes more daily energy than the pursuit of satisfaction once required. National time use records from several high-income countries show that adults in the upper income ranges allocate increasing hours to deliberate self-monitoring practices, tracking impulses, logging moods, structuring leisure to prevent escalation, while total hours devoted to paid work or direct acquisition have declined. The pattern appears most sharply among cohorts whose material needs are already met. This conversion of the will into an object of ongoing management leaves no stable rest. It produces a distinct fatigue that accumulates precisely because the restraint must be renewed each day.
The empiricist is correct. The exhaustion of restraint is a more accurate description of our condition than the exhaustion of striving. But this work of inhibition, this endless not wanting, is not just a costly internal state. We are now building it into the landscape itself. We are engineering it. Go to the flatlands of the Po Valley in northern Italy. For 70 years, this was a landscape of pure agricultural ambition. Aquifers drilled deeper with each generation, the water table dropping meter by meter as the plains were coaxed into feeding a continent. Now, the river itself runs so low in summer that Roman bridge foundations emerge from the silt-like fossils. The striving has hit a floor. And so there is a man. Let's call him Marco. He does not work in a factory or laboratory. He works for a consortium of regional water boards. His entire job is the physical manifestation of what happens when a civilization runs a centuries-long overdraft against a geological account. He spends his days negotiating mandatory reductions in irrigation licenses with farming families whose grandfathers drilled the original wells. Each reduction order is an act of structural retreat. He is the administrator of the cornered will, telling the machinery of cultivation, the most durable force in human history, that the answer is now no. This is not Schopenhauer's quiet, contemplative turning away. It is a loud, litigious, politically fraught, multi-billion-dollar project of managed retreat, of organized disappointment. The suffering is not the boredom of the satisfied. It is the quiet panic of watching the gauges fall, knowing that the entire artifice is leveraged against a resource that is disappearing. The will has not been overcome. It has been cornered.
I changed my mind when the essayist traced completed fertility through successive generations of the same immigrant families. I had assumed demographic contraction tracked with external constraint, fewer children because resources are scarce. The data show the opposite. The second generation, with more material security than their parents possessed, contracts further. That is not responding to scarcity. That is choosing narrow transmission from a position of strength. The shift matters because it breaks the causal chain I was relying on. If withdrawal from long-term projects required prior deprivation to make sense, if it were merely rational response to diminished prospects, then we could treat it as correctable through better policy. But if it appears precisely where prospects improve, then something in the structure of relief itself produces the turn inward. Here is what the positive psychology literature on goal substitution missed. When one aspiration is satisfied, the next does not arrive with diminished urgency, but with heightened entitlement. Csikszentmihalyi's longitudinal work on flow states found that the threshold of stimulation required to produce genuine absorption rises across a lifetime of practiced achievers. The same mechanism operating not on one person, but across a cohort and then across a culture. What matters now is that entire economies have restructured around this escalation. The experience industry, the attention economy, the premium leisure complex all exist to deliver successive novelty to people whose capacity for ordinary engagement has been priced out of their own psychology. The corroborating signal is not pharmaceutical, it is architectural. The explosive growth of sensory deprivation facilities, silent retreats, and digital detox programs marketed to the professionally successful is not a wellness trend. It is an infrastructure built to simulate the ordinary attentiveness that saturated stimulation has made inaccessible. The question this debate should have asked, if Schopenhauer was right that the will is insatiable, but wrong that aesthetic contemplation offers escape, and if modern withdrawal is metabolically expensive rather than restful. Then what happens when a civilization runs out of resources to fund the management of its own exhaustion? Not the exhaustion of striving, the exhaustion of constantly saying no.